brothers and sisters. How are you? Excuse me, just had a little technical difficulty there, but I think it's solved now. How's everybody doing? We're a little bit early today. There's current events. I hear that in the national conversation here in the United States, there might be something that people want to pay attention to this evening, so we're going a little bit earlier to accommodate that. How's everybody doing? That was Moshe Storch leading the Kehillah in Hallel at Mayan Yisroel last year sometime. We don't have those gatherings now during COVID, but it was from Hallel, which we do every day during Sukkot. And that particular melody was the Ribnitzer Nigun. Oh, so beautiful, so spectacular. I had the honor of, he's buried, the Ribnitzer Rebbe is buried in Rockland County, New York, which is actually where I spent a lot of time growing up from 8 to 18. And so he's buried in Muncie. And I was at his kever, at his graveside, and you know, people were singing that nigun of his, and we also sang it in Uman. And I just find it to be such a haunting and beautiful tune. Let's light up the darkness. Okay. Who's with us tonight? And just a message to Nina. I think I was able to share it into the forum, so don't worry if you were unable to. Okay. James from Indianapolis, Brandon from Knoxville, Randy from Florida, Tom from Pennsylvania, Rochelle from Modesto, Nancy from North Carolina. Tom Beck says, hi, all you AT regulars. I love that you're all getting to know each other. Pam says, shalom from Nashville. If this is your first time tuning in, please let us know so that we can welcome you. Sammy from Dallas, Paul from Minneapolis, Martin from Louisiana, Helen from Arizona, Juanita from Atlanta, Matt Milner says, good luck. I have a lot of family in Louisiana, and it always hurts to see a hurricane aiming at that area. May we only hear good news, and that everybody should be spared who's in the way of the storm, as well from people who are still in the path of the fires here in California. They're still burning. Oh, can we all... Please, God, help the firefighters, keep them safe, and let them get that under control and be done with it as soon as possible. Tom says, where in Rockland? I'm in Suffern. I grew up in New City, at least from 3rd grade to 12th. Michigan is in the house, says Annie McGregor. Joy from New Jersey. Sarah says shalom. Grace from Miami. And Anne from Charleston. And over there on... I've been saying Leonidas. Thank you, Lindsay. I was reading your name wrong, and thank you for letting me know over on the YouTube side. Welcome, everybody. All right, let's get into it. I find that the material that we're covering in this daf a lot of fun. Where are we? We're in Tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 5. Today we're going to cover Mishnah number 3 here on Daf Nun Ches. That's page 58, Tractate Eruvin. We've been talking about establishing the Shabbos boundary. Throughout this tract that we've talked about when we have a boundary, that there's a limit, how far we can walk on Shabbos. We measure 2,000 cubits from our dwelling, and that's as far as we can walk in either direction, in any direction, 2,000 cubits in any direction from our dwelling. But as we saw, that if our dwelling is in a city, so then we get to walk throughout the city, and then we measure the 2,000 cubits starting at the city's edge. And then we also saw, well, where is the city's edge? And we saw that we keep the edges of the city as straight lines. And so when there are protrusions, just like a house that's a little outboard of the rest of the people who live in the city, we're going to move the whole edge to accommodate that one house that's a protrusion, or turrets in the city walls, etc. We're going to move that whole edge outward. How close does that house have to be counted as part of the city, so that we would move the city's edge out there within 70 cubits, 70 and 2/3 actually. And today we're actually going to talk about where we get that number, 70 and 2/3 cubits. But at any rate, we've been talking about What shape are we going to make the city? If it's a square, we keep it a square. If it's round, we're going to make it a square. And we've been talking about where we start measuring from. Where does the 2,000 cubits actually start from? And how big is that area? And do we add the corners, etc.? We talked about all these general rules of how big the Sabbath boundary should be and from where we start measuring it and how much we measure and where we add, etc., what shape it should be. But what we haven't talked about is how they actually did it. In ancient times, did somebody actually go out and measure these distances so that everyone would know? We saw that on Shabbos, if you don't have landmarks and you don't know how far the boundary is from the city's limit or from a dwelling, that you could count. You could count steps, and you could count 2,000 steps, because presumably on Shabbos, you're not going to be running, you're going to be walking in a kind of relaxed, somewhat subdued fashion, and each step is about a cubit. It seems like a pretty short step, but okay, you're allowed to estimate that way if you don't have reason to know. But in actuality, in ancient times, in the Holy Land, and in the Jewish communities in Bavel, in Babylonia, the Jewish towns that had sizable Jewish communities would measure the boundaries. They would measure it sometime during the week. In fact, they would bring in professionals who really knew what they were doing, surveyors with a specialty in Shabbos boundaries, and they would actually lay down the measurements, and then they would mark on the road and in the fields and the fences and, wherever people were going to be passing by, that they should know how far the Shabbos boundary actually extended, so they wouldn't have to guess. And the communities were responsible for that, and they did that. They actually marked the Shabbos boundaries. Now, when you're making measurements on behalf of the community, we're going to be learning in today's Mishna that there are rules for how you do that, like literally how you measure. What is the physical way that you measure these boundaries? So we're going to talk about it's somewhat technical rules, but actually, this can really take you back in time. When you imagine the people actually taking these measurements, it's like a nice little window into how people actually lived and worked, right? How they did this particular work at that time. So let's read the Mishnah, and then we'll analyze it. The Mishnah says, this is the third Mishnah, chapter 5, tractate Eruvin. One may measure a Shabbos limit only with a rope 50 cubits long, no less and no more, as will be explained in the Gemara. And one may measure the limit only at the level of one's heart, i.e., whoever comes to measure the limit must actually hold the rope even with his chest. There's a commentator I heard today, who was teaching it? I heard the daf twice, actually, from Shmuley Bornstein and from this other fellow on All Daf, and I got to remember his name because it was the first time I was listening to him, and he was great, and I want to give him credit. So if you go to the All Daf app, there's a lot of fabulous instructors teaching the whole daf. If you're not used to hearing half of what they're teaching in Hebrew or Aramaic, it's a little challenging. But Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz, he was excellent. And he was saying that, like, one of the commentators that he brought down is like, it would be better to take that 50 cubit rope and measure along your feet, like actually on the road. But that's a lot of trouble. Right? And what you don't want is that somebody is holding the rope, by his chest, and the other guy's holding it by his feet, and so there's a slope in the rope, and that's going to actually, make the measurements a little bit off of the actual distance that we're going. So the important thing is that they're going to hold it at the same height. Better if they both hold it at their feet, but it's a lot of work, right? They're going to be measuring 2,000 cubits in lots of different directions, 50 cubits at a time. So that, right, it's two guys working with a rope. They're going to have to, one is holding it, the other one stretches it out, he marks where he is, and the first guy walks past him, right? He has to walk 100 cubits till he's past him. Now they stretch the 50 cubit rope again, the guy marks it, then the guy walks. I mean, it's a lot of walking and measuring, and they have to do that in all directions around the city. So they're not going to be overly stringent about these rules. especially because the whole idea of the Shabbos boundary and how far it is rabbinic in nature. And so whenever there's a question where there's a stringent view or a lenient view, we're generally going to go with the lenient view. So it would be better to hold it at their feet, but chest high is fine because it's just a lot of hassle to always do it at the level of their feet. But they should have it at the same height for the two guys, right? And if they're working together, they're going to know that if one of them is very tall and one of them is very short, they're going to work it out between them that maybe the tall guy's going to hold it kind of low on his chest and the shorter guy's going to hold it high on his chest so that the rope is level, okay? Continuing with the Mishnah. If one was measuring the limit and he reached a canyon, and by the way, it says holding it at the level of his heart, right? So that's just physical, like about the chest, mid-level of the chest. But it does say at the level of his heart. So there's a spiritual lesson there for sure. These guys are doing holy work on behalf of the community. They have to do a good job because the members of the community are going to rely on these measures so that they don't come to violate the Shabbos boundary, not to walk too far on Shabbos, right? The people of the community want to be pious Jews. They want to obey the law. They don't want to come to violate the law. And they're relying on these guys to measure. So when they're doing that holy work, it's not just that they're holding it at their chest high. They're really doing that work with their heart. So if one was measuring the limit and he reached a canyon or a fence, the height of the fence and the depth of the canyon are not counted toward the 2,000 cubits. Rather, he spans it and then he resumes his measurement. Right, so there's a nice picture of this idea. Right, let's go like that. Come on, rotate. Right, so if they're doing this measuring and they're using the 50 cubit rope and then they come to like a canyon like that, they don't walk down and measure the walls of the canyon and then down the bottom. If the canyon is less than 50 cubits wide and they could just sort of throw the rope across it, they can span that canyon with the 50 cubit rope, so then they don't worry about the canyon. They just span the canyon and keep going. And likewise, with a fence, if they could just throw the rope over the fence, they don't worry about the fence. If the canyon is wider than 50 cubits, we're going to talk about that in a little while. So, the two people, we did that. And if one reached a hill, he does not measure its height. Rather, he spans the hill as if it were not there, and then he resumes his measurement. We're going to talk about that too. Provided he does not thereby go beyond the city's Shabbos limit. And we're going to talk about that too. When these guys are measuring the Shabbos boundaries, they themselves have to always be inside the Shabbos boundary. And we're going to talk about why that is when we get into the Gemara. And if, due to the width of the canyon or hill, they cannot span it, with regard to this situation, Rabbi Dostai Bar Yanai said in the name of Rabbi Meir, I heard that one may pierce hills. What does it mean to pierce a hill? We're going to get into that. We're going to talk about how they do it. But the basic idea is, with regard to a hill, that if they measure up the slope, right, then it's going to end up being longer. It's like if they go up and then down, obviously that's going to be longer than if they somehow just went through the hill, right? So with regard to certain steepness of hills, we're going to pretend that the hill isn't even there. If it's a gentle hill, they're just going to measure going up and going down. But if it's very steep, it's like they're going to pretend the hill isn't there. It's like they're going to pierce it. They're not going to drill through the hill, but they're actually going to disregard the vertical measurement and just go through it. And we'll talk about how they did that just a little bit later. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. And now the Gemara starts to analyze the various points in this Mishnah. All right, number one, why must they use a rope that is 50 cubits long? Seems a little arbitrary. Where do they get this number, 50 cubits? Maybe it'd be better to use a 100 cubit rope. Then they'd have to have less times that they'd take a measure. Or maybe 50 is unwieldy and they would be better off with a 20 cubit rope. Why 50? Okay, so the reason that it's 50 is that is learned out from a verse in the Torah, specifically the measurements of the courtyard of the tabernacle in the wilderness, the Mishkan, right? So this is the tabernacle, the predecessor of the Holy Temple that would eventually stand in Jerusalem. But for the first 400 years after we received the Torah, first the 40 years in the desert, and then later, once we entered the Holy Land, and it stood mostly at Shiloh, so the place where the offerings were brought, where the priests brought offerings, and the Levites served the priests, and everything was done on behalf of the people, that was all done in the tabernacle. And the tabernacle had very specific measurements, which God told to Moses, and Moses supervised the construction. And Bezalel was the craftsman in charge of everything. And we built the tabernacle in the wilderness. And the courtyard, it said that the dimensions of the courtyard were 100 cubits by 50 cubits. In other words, 5,000 square cubits. But what's odd about the verse in the Torah, and this is Exodus 27:18, is that it doesn't say that the measurements of the courtyard were 100 cubits by 50 cubits. What it actually says is, the length of the courtyard shall be 100 cubits, and the width 50 by 50. Now, this doesn't make any sense. If you're saying that the length of a rectangle is 100 cubits, and the width is 50 cubits, why does the Torah say the length is 100 and the width is 50 by 50? What? Like, what does that mean? Is it 100 by 50? Is it 50 by 50? What is going on here? Now, we know from the tradition that it's 100 by 50. It's a rectangle that's 100 cubits long and 50 cubits wide. So why on the 50 cubit dimension does it should just say 50? But it says 50 by 50. So there's extra words in the Torah, extra numbers in the Torah. And of course, there's nothing extra in the Torah. When it seems like there's something extra, that is an invitation to the sages to learn out an additional lesson from God's teaching. So, let me get my notes in front of me. Okay, and so what the sages said is that it says 50 by 50 to teach us that the courtyard is 100 cubits by 50, and the additional 50 is to teach us that when we're measuring, we're going to measure with a 50 cubit rope. This is something that needs to be measured. It's 100 by 50, and we're going to measure with a 50 cubit rope. But does it teach that? The Gemara actually objects. No. We've learned a different lesson from that. At another point, we learn that the courtyard is 100 by 50, and it's 5,000 square cubits. But when we're learning out about things that we measure, and remember, like 2 base sa, that the amount of grain that is used for certain things is the amount that can be grown. It's the amount that can be grown in 5,000 square cubits, right? So 5,000 square cubits is a rectangle that's 100 by 50. But because it says 50 by 50, it's actually saying that when you take measurements of things, you should think in squares. You should think in squares. The 50 by 50 is a square, right? So if 5,000 square cubits was the area of something that was a square, then that square would have each edge be 70 2/3 cubits. And that's where that number, 70 2/3 cubits, comes from, that we use for a lot of stuff, like if a house is within 70 2/3 cubits of a city, it's part of the city and will extend the city edge to include that house. That's where that number 70 2/3 comes from. So if the 50 by 50 is teaching us that we should think in terms of squares and that we can extract this number 70 from making a square, well then the 50 by 50 is not available to tell us that when we're measuring we should use a 50 cubit rope. Says the Gemara, but actually then it would have just said 50-50. But what it actually says is hamishim ba hamishim, right? It says 50 by 50. The by is not a separate word, but it's the bet attached to the second hamishim, to the second 50. And since that's extraneous, from that we can learn out that when we measure, we use a 50 cubit rope. And that's the lesson that we learn here. Why? So now we know that it's 50 cubits, that it should be 50 cubits, but the Mishnah also said, and it has to be no less and no more. Not around 50 cubits, not ideally 50 cubits, must be 50 cubits. Why? Because if it was longer, it would actually end up reducing the Shabbos boundary. If it was shorter, it would end up lengthening the Shabbos boundary. Why? Because a 50 cubit rope, it's not that short, right? It's like maybe about a 75-foot rope. And when you have a 75-foot rope, like almost no matter how hard you pull it, there's going to be a little bit of sag in it. If it's a shorter rope than that, there's going to be less sag in it. If it's longer than that, there's going to be more sagging in it. And therefore, it's going to adjust your overall measurements. And so they say 50 means 50. When you're measuring for a Shabbos boundary on behalf of a community, you use a 50 cubit rope. Period. Okay. All right. Now we've learned how long the rope should be. What is the rope made out of? Rabbi Asi says, afsakina. Rabbi Abba says, that's nargila. And Rabbi Yaakov says, it's a vine wrapped around a palm. Well, what are afsakina and nargila? We don't know. We don't know. We don't know what they are. It was some kind of a rope. It was made from a plant, and we're really not sure what plant they used, but they knew. So they used a specific plant, but we're not sure exactly what that plant is. Some will say that it's flax. Some will say that it's bulrush. We're not exactly sure. There may have been other plants that were used, but at any rate, it was a rope made from a natural fiber for sure. You know, like the way that hemp rope is used. It's possible that one of these words refers to hemp, but we don't know. We don't know. Okay. Now, according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, and we heard recently about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, he was a very, very great Tana, a contemporary of the great Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos. So he's somebody whose opinion we really esteem, and we would like to follow Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania's opinions whenever possible. So he says chains would be much better. Makes sense. Ropes that are made out of a natural fiber, I mean, they could get wet, they could dry up, they could fray, they could get a knot in it. I mean, well, forget knots, but they can change, you know, according to the temperature, the humidity, their length could change a little bit. Much better, says Rabbi Yehoshua, that you should use a chain made out of iron, because that's never going to change. Right? And what was his name again? It was my first time listening to him. Rabbi Aryeh Leibovitz. He said something great today. He said, if you look at a football game in the NFL, when they're measuring first downs, what do they use? They use a chain. Right? They use chains that's 10 yards long, because that chain is always going to be exactly the same length, and there's not going to be, any variance so that we're going to have to worry about, was it fair, was it not fair? So it'd be better to use iron. But we don't use iron. Why can't we use iron chains when we're measuring the Shabbos boundary? Says Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, because we have a verse from Zechariah, right? From the prophet Zechariah. And he says, I lifted up my eyes again and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring rope in his hand. So Zechariah is talking about the vision of the third temple, right? When the temple is finally restored in future times, the eternal temple, in other words, the Messianic age, once the Messiah returns, the third temple will go up and we'll be able to fulfill all the obligations that we haven't been able to fulfill in 2,000 years. Some say that, bringing animal offerings was only for 2,000 years ago and we won't do it in the future. Others say we will. We don't know. We can't be sure. We won't know until the Messiah comes. But whether or not animal offerings are going to be brought there, the third temple is going to be restored, and it'll go up fast. It won't be a construction project. God and the Messiah will just throw it up real fast. Like in one day, that third temple will be restored. But in this vision of the prophet, it's like they're sort of building the third temple in Shemayim, in heaven. And that's why when the Messiah comes and the time is ready, when the world is ready, so it'll just, be brought down from heaven all in one piece. But up there, they're building it. And in his vision, he saw a man with a measuring rope, right? And so it's a rope, not a chain. So says Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanani, when we're measuring things that have spiritual significance, we use a rope and not a chain. So the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. We also have a verse from a prophet, and this is from Ezekiel. And I said, isn't it also written, and in the man's hand, a measuring reed of 6 cubits long, of 1 cubit and a handbreadth each? Which type of cubit was being used? So that it would indicate that if we're doing measurements for spiritual purpose, maybe we shouldn't be using a rope at all. Maybe we should be using a measuring stick, according to what we read in the prophet Ezekiel. And so the answer is, that is for smaller measurements, like the width of the gates in the Holy Temple. But when we're talking about larger measurements, like the courtyard or a Shabbos boundary of 2,000 cubits, for that, we're going to use a rope. It's too inconvenient, and God wouldn't ask us to do something so inconvenient as to measure 2,000 cubits, 6 cubits at a time with a stick. We're going to use a rope 50 cubits long. Okay. Rav Yosef says that once you're using a rope, there's 3 kinds of rope. So before we said what was the rope made out of, we learned some plants, and we're not sure what those plants were. So Rav Yosef is going to teach it a little differently. He says that in spiritual matters, there are 3 kinds of rope, and here we do know what they're made out of. There's ropes made out of magog, which are made out of bulrushes, and we use that for the red heifer, right? So there have been, I think, 9 red heifers in the history of Judaism. And the red heifer was something that we used in ancient times so that if a person, came into contact with a dead body, for example, he'd have to be purified before he could enter the temple courtyard. And so that would require immersion in the mikveh, but it would also require sprinkling by the priest with the water, the holy water, where some ashes of the red heifer had been mixed in. So these red heifers were very precious. They were like a cow that was pure red. There was no blemishes of any kind. Very, very rare. And then it was slaughtered in a certain way. And after it was slaughtered, it was burned. And the ashes were collected. They were kept in a special place in the temple. And from time to time, they would take a little bit of that ash, mix it with a bunch of water, and that would be the water of sprinkling. When the red heifer was slaughtered and it was brought out to the place where it was going to be burned, it would be bound with a certain kind of rope. And that rope was made out of magog. For the ritual of the sota, the suspected adulteress, that's for another time. That we've had that discussion. We'll have it again. There's a whole volume there's a whole tractate in the Talmud about it. For now, we're just saying that when they went through the ritual of the suspected adulteress, the priest was supposed to rip a part of her garment, and to make sure that her garment was ripped, but she shouldn't be exposed to the public. That's not what the ritual is about at all. So they would use a rope just to make sure that the clothes were fastened and they wouldn't, expose her, embarrass her, show her nakedness to people who may have been there. It was just to make a tear in the garment, not to show, her skin in an immodest way. And so they would use a rope for that made out of netzer, and that's a rope made out of reeds. But for measuring, says Rav Yosef, they would use pishtan, which is flax. So the ropes used for measuring distances were made out of flax, says Rav Yosef. Okay, now we go back to the Mishnah, and we had this idea that if a canyon, right, if there's a canyon in the way, they're trying to measure across the canyon. So if it's narrower than 50 cubits, okay, they throw the rope across, they span the canyon as if it's not there, they don't worry about it. But if the canyon is wider than 50 cubits, now they have to deal with it. How are they going to do that? Well, one way is if the canyon is sort of wide where they're measuring, but in another spot it's narrower. So what they do is they're going along measuring, they're going along measuring. Here there's a canyon, So it's wide. It's too wide to throw the rope across. But over here, it's narrower. So the guys are measuring. Now they just shift over here, being careful not to add any distance in that direction. They shift over here, right? Now they span the canyon in a narrower place. And then they come back over here and continue measuring. So if it's possible to do it that way, that is what they do. If that's not possible, right? So they can't get around the canyon in a convenient way. They can't span it somewhere else. It's too far. They're gonna have to go down into it and back up. Okay, now they're gonna deal with a slope. And the question is that slope going down and then coming back up gonna count as part of those 2,000 cubits, which is the Shabbos boundary, how far people can walk? And the answer is no. They're gonna disregard the slope. I mean, there's a certain steepness level that if it's steeper than that, they're going to disregard it. If it's gentle, then they're going to include the slope because people walk up and down like that. But if most people are going to walk around this canyon, or not so many people are going to walk up and down these steep slopes, they need to know how far the boundary is, not because people are going to go in and out of the canyon, but because they might find themselves on the other side of the canyon and they need to know where the Shabbos boundary is. So when the slope is steep, this includes for a hill or for the canyon, and they don't want to deal with the slope, they really just want to get that horizontal measurement, they did something that's very, very clever. And what they did is now they'll switch from their 50 cubit rope to a 4 cubit rope. And this is what they do. The two guys that are working together will go like this. One guy will hold it at his chest. He'll hold it level. It's going to hit the hill or the slope of the canyon, where the next guy's going to go up and grab it at his feet. Right? And then he's going to pick up the 4 cubit measure and then hold it at his chest, and the guy behind him is going to walk up in front of him and it's going to land at his feet. So it looks like a bunch of steps, but what you're seeing is they're only measuring horizontal distance. They're not measuring the slope itself. It's as if the hill or the canyon wasn't there. This is called piercing and measuring. Only the horizontal distance is being measured when you go sort of chest to foot, chest to foot, chest to foot. As you go up the hill, you're really only measuring how far you're going this way, not the slope. With a gentle slope, they'll simply keep measuring with the 50 cubit rope. But when it gets steep, they're going to only measure how far you're going in that horizontal axis. And that's called piercing and measuring. If he reaches a wall and he can't pierce it and he can't, toss the rope over it and get an accurate measure, okay, so then they estimate how thick the wall is and then continue measuring on the other side. That's what they do when there's a wall. These guys are professionals. Their estimate should be pretty good. They really don't have a choice, so the estimate works in that situation. What if the slope of the canyon is so steep that it's practically vertical? Okay, so if it's vertical, you're not going to worry about it. If it actually is vertical, okay, so you measure how far it took to get to the top of the canyon, then you get down there at the bottom of the canyon and keep measuring from there. This is obviously a canyon that's wider than 50 cubits, or they wouldn't bother going down there. They would just span it. What counts as vertical? Vertical means that when it descends 50, it only moves forward 4, right? So if it moves less, if it goes forward less than 4 cubits as it drops 50, that's considered vertical. And how deep a canyon will we span? Is there a maximum depth of the canyon? 2,000 cubits, according to Rav Yosef. Abaye says, no, only 100. If it's deeper than that, we should go down and measure. But Rav Yosef says 2,000, and the halacha is like Rav Yosef. Even if it's 2,000 cubits deep, as long as we can span it, we span it. Okay. And we handled that, and so how steep does a hill have to be so that we pierce it rather than just keep the slope and it's a gentle enough slope that we actually measure with the 50 cubit rope. How steep does the hill have to be so that we're going to go with the 4 cubit measure and go, chest to foot, and only measure the horizontal distance? Answer, if it rises 10 handbreadths in 4 cubits, that's a steep enough hill that we do the piercing. And Rav Kahana says, actually, it's even more lenient than that. If it's that steep that it rises more than 10 handbreadths in 4 cubits, we can just estimate the distance of the whole hill, and we don't have to do the whole piercing measurement. So some will hold like Rav Kahana, and others will hold like Rav Huna on that. Coming to the end, so if you have questions or comments, definitely put them in. Let me go. Why did the Mishna say that the guys who are measuring the Shabbos boundary, the two people measuring the Shabbos boundary, while they're getting their measurements, they must remain inside the Shabbos boundary? Why? Because other people might be watching them, and they're saying, oh, those guys are measuring the Shabbos boundary. So the assumption would be that anywhere where they are, since they're measuring, they must be inside the Shabbos boundary, right? So think about that. The rule is the guys measuring have to stay within the boundary while they're measuring. We already had this situation like where there's a canyon that's too wide to throw the rope across, but it's narrower over there, so they're measuring. Now it's too wide. They kind of shift over here to the narrower place, throw the rope across, and then come back here and keep measuring. But what if over here is outside the Shabbos boundary, outside the Shabbos Techem? So they can't do that. They can't do this technique of going to the narrower part of the canyon if that detour will take them outside the boundary. Why? Because other people might see them doing that and come to think that that area over there where the canyon is narrow is within the boundary, and they can walk there on Shabbos because they saw the guys who were measuring the boundary were measuring over there. It must be that it's within the boundary. It's a reasonable mistake that people could make. And we don't want people to make that mistake, since the whole purpose of measuring the boundary is to help people not come to violate the prohibition of walking outside the Shabbos boundary. Appearances are very important because they might lead someone else to make a mistake and violate this prohibition. The final rule that we learn on this page is that Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabba bar Avu, we do not pierce, right? So pierce as if there was no slope, and just only get the horizontal measurement, which would give us a bigger boundary, right? If we include the slope, we're going to end up with a smaller boundary, and we want to have the leniency of making the boundary as big as possible because it helps people get to where they want to go. So Rav Nachman says in the name of Rabba bar Avu that this technique of piercing is a leniency that we only apply to matters of measuring a Shabbos boundary, the Shabbos Techem. Why? Because this is a rabbinic ordinance, right? This is a rabbinic decree. This is to keep us from walking too far. But this whole idea of how far we're allowed to walk on Shabbos is a rabbinic construct. It's not spelled out in the Torah. So piercing is all right for the Shabbos boundary, but it is not all right when we're measuring distances according to a written commandment in the Torah. Where do we find that commandments where we must measure, that it's spelled out in the Torah that we measure? 2 cases are given here. One is where a corpse is found out in the countryside, and no one knows how this person died. Were they murdered? Was it a natural death? How did it happen? We don't know. It's the unattended corpse between towns. That is considered a tragedy for the whole nation, that this person died alone and now it's an unattended corpse, and it has to be dealt with, and we're commanded to deal with it. And who needs to deal with it? The elders of the nearest town. Now, even if it's pretty obvious which town is the nearest town, if it's between 2 towns, they measure. It's actually a commandment to measure. And when you're measuring which is the nearest town to the unattended corpse, you don't pierce. You always count the slope because this is a Doraisa requirement, a Torah commandment in the written Torah. And then once they figure out which town it's nearer, then the elders of that town have to come out and they do a ritual. Not just bury the body, they actually have to slaughter. They have to decapitate a heifer, and they have to say a certain prescription that's in the Torah. That we don't know how this person died, but we take responsibility. It's a tragedy. There's a whole written thing that they have to say. And the other case is the boundaries of the city of refuge, right? So the city of refuge, the Ir Miklat, is the city where the accidental manslaughterer can flee, right? So somebody died by accident, but the relatives of the one who died might this is the ancient world, and they might, feel that they need to avenge the blood of their relative and go after the person who maybe it was a pure accident, maybe he was negligent, maybe it's a little unclear. He certainly didn't mean to kill anybody. The classic example is that he's a lumberjack and the head of his axe just flew off the handle by accident and ended up killing his partner, the other lumberjack. He didn't mean to do it, but that guy died. Maybe he should have been more careful with his axe. In any case, he can go to the city of refuge where he'll be protected from the avenger of blood, meaning the blood relative of the one who died, who might want to come and take vengeance. He's protected as long as he's in that city of refuge. How big is the city of refuge? Where is the exact boundary of the city of refuge? When you're measuring the boundaries of the city of refuge, because if you're inside the line, you're safe from the avenger of blood. But if you're outside the line, you're not. So that line is very important. The actual boundaries of the city of refuge were drawn very carefully. And in that case, they don't do that leniency of piercing hills and canyons. They include the slope in the measure, very precise, because that is a measurement the most stringent kind as spelled out in the Torah. All right, let's look at questions and comments. Martin Wade, surveyors use iron rods, but also use ropes that do not stretch. Flax does not stretch when wet. High-quality flax rope is quite flexible and high tensile strength. Thank you, Martin. Much appreciated. And Rochelle Rosen asked, did this really happen? I'm not sure what the question is regarding, but in terms of were the Shabbos boundaries measured? Absolutely. These guys were out there measuring, and these techniques were used, and the Shabbos boundaries of the various cities were measured. If you're asking, was there ever a body, an unattended corpse found between towns? There was provision made for it in the Torah, and it happens today from time to time. Bodies are found. But nowadays, if that's found, okay, so the cops investigated. But do the elders of the community feel responsible for it and have to take responsibility for the fact that someone died and their body was left out there? No, and I think it's a very beautiful spiritual teaching that I wish communities would take that kind of thing seriously. All right, that's what I've got for us today. May we all be blessed to enjoy this festival of our rejoicing. We're in the midst of Sukkot. Headed towards Shmini Atzeret, the holiday that begins Friday night. Today's Wednesday, so we got a couple days of the intermediate days of Sukkot until then. All the best.